So today we're interviewing Quentin Bates. So Quentin escaped English suburbia as a teenager and headed over to Iceland, where he stayed for over 10 years. He now writes crime novels set in present-day Iceland and has written 9, including Chilled to the Bone, Thin Ice and Cold Breath. As well as being a prolific writer, he also translates other authors' work. Over to you to introduce which authors.
Ragnar Jónasson, I've translated 5 of his books in the Dark Iceland series. And then there is the lovely Lilja Sigurðardóttir, and I've translated 4 of her books so far, which is the 3 in the Reykjavik Noir series, and then there's a standalone called Betrayal, which is coming out very soon, and it's disturbing stuff.
In the best way?
The faint-hearted.
It's good stuff. And then at the moment I'm working on 2 books by an as yet untranslated author called Solveig Pálsdóttir. And the first one will be out towards the end of this year, and that's called The Fox.
Ooh, I like that.
It's
dark.
Are
they're all crime books?
Yes, I've translated other stuff as well, but these are the crime books. I've done some seafaring books as well.
You know how you sort of got into Iceland, but we don't know how you got into writing. Sort of when did that happen in your journey? What inspired you to do it?
It's been something that's always been there at the back of my mind ever since I was a kid, I suppose. And I sort of pushed it away for a long time as well. And my professional background is I trained as a ship's officer. Wow. So I was a trawlerman for a long time. Okay. Deadliest catch trawlerman, that kind of stuff, deep seas and big boats. And after, at a certain point, I drifted into journalism by the back door, writing about maritime stuff. And that's really how the writing sort of started to take off. Okay. So I wrote about shipping. I still do as well. I still do this stuff. I still write about shipping and fish and radars and quotas and all that kind of stuff. But fiction became a bit of a release. And I'd done a lot of translation of technical stuff, news articles and things like that. And then the lovely Karen Sullivan of Arenda Books took on, when she just started up, she took on this unknown Icelandic author called Ragnar Jónasson and said, "You'll translate it, won't you?" I said, "Yeah, okay, I'll give it a go." And that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Wow. And is that what inspired you to give crime a go yourself, purely in the fictional sense?
No, I was already deep in criminal activity by then anyway.
Okay. And then that's how you met her at Arenda Books.
Yes, actually we met at a crime festival in Iceland that Ragnar and I and Lilja Sigurðardóttir organised.
Oh, wow. I've always wanted to go to that specific crime festival.
This is to Iceland Noir.
Yes.
Yes, it's good. Yeah, I'm not actually involved in it anymore.
Oh,
because it's so much work that I took a step back. So I'm still there as this sort of Papa Smurf figure in the background, but I'm not actually involved in the nuts and bolts of it anymore. Well, for the moment, anyway. I won't say anymore. I say for the moment.
For now. What role do you think those kind of crime festivals and events plays in the crime community? Because it seems to me that I'm an avid crime reader myself, but it seems like the crime community really do stick together in terms of the fans and following a series. So do you think the festival plays a big part in that?
I think the festivals are important. They're just loads of fun. Because these people who spend their days sitting in a dark back bedroom typing murder and misery, and they're let out into the sunshine to talk to normal people, and there's a bar there, and they just and these are the people who are still there in the bar when the cleaners arrive in the morning. Crime festivals they can be brilliant.
Like in crime festivals as well, what is kind of special about even just the crime community is that the big stars really mingle, don't they?
They do, yeah.
So you get to meet.
Yeah, you just sort of bump into somebody. Oh, your child. Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. Peter James and people like that, and Val McDermid are just there amongst the crowd. It's rather wonderful.
That's brilliant.
So I was going to ask you about because we've sort of talked about you've done a bit of translating and you work at the Crime Festival. It'd be really interesting to hear about your journey into getting published originally. So sort of how you managed to send that first successful manuscript off.
Ooh. Where shall we go? Where shall we start? I'm hoping my former editor isn't going to listen to this. I don't think he will be, but he's
no comment. I don't know.
Blocking.
I was working on a magazine, and I worked on there for many years, and the editor was a strange character, to say the least. I'm still in touch with him, and he's a great guy, but he has his own ways of doing things. And everything that appeared in the magazine had to be as if he had written it. There was no imagination or use of your own voice, anything. It was as if he had written everything. And fiction was started as a release from not having to write in his awful style.
Okay.
And actually the assistant editor and the ad sales guy were also writing novels at the same time, but I didn't find that out till quite a long time later.
Interesting.
So that's how it started. And then I did a course as well, which helped a lot. And once I'd got the first draft of the manuscript, I sent it to a couple of publishers who just looked at it and said, thanks, but no thanks. And a couple of agents who did the same. And finally, I think it was the fourth or fifth agent I sent it to said, yes, looks interesting. Come to London and I'll buy you lunch.
Wonderful.
And he bought me lunch at BAFTA, and I was completely starstruck. Because he used to be a scriptwriter, a screenwriter, so he gets to be a BAFTA member. So we had lunch at BAFTA, and I just said, "Yeah, I'll do whatever you want." So that was the first book, and immediately started getting a much better class of rejection letter. Until Christina at Constable jumped on it and said, yes, we'll give this a go. So they bought 2 books, and they published the rest of them since then.
Brilliant. And how did you manage that, the inevitable rejection and kind of, I suppose, the insecurity that might come with being on that journey and not knowing if you're going to get published? Was that something you found difficult? Or did you think about giving up?
I think after having been a journalist or having worked in that sort of area with a fairly brutal editor as well, you get hardened a little bit to it. Mm-hmm. So it didn't worry me a great deal. I just figured that anything in that direction was good. Yeah. Because there are so many people who don't even get that far, don't even get to an agent, or don't even get the manuscript read. So I just figured this okay, it's progress. That's fine.
I think you're right. I think actually the rejection letter is sort of the first level compliment, isn't it, in a way? Yes, it is. But if you've had somebody who's actually asked for the whole manuscript, and then clearly read it and said, well, this is okay, but we don't like this and we don't like that, and we've already got another Scandi author anyway, so we'll pass on it. Then it's the one where it comes back in, it's obviously gone from one envelope to another without even being looked at. Those are the infuriating ones.
Mm-hmm. There's a hierarchy of rejections.
Yes. The rejection letters that come from an agent submission are a higher class of rejection letter.
Yeah, I love the idea of that. And what about your writing process itself, Quentin? So when you start on a new book or a new series, how do you plan it out? Do you kind of think about everything beforehand, or is it a little bit more fluid with the ideas coming as you go?
Oh, it's very fluid. I think the right word is probably shambolic.
No, because it's obviously successful.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that.
I don't know. Some of them come quite easily and some of them don't. Mm-hmm. This one was a struggle. This is the book that really, really didn't want to be written.
What number book is that in your series? Because I wonder if that had any like significance.
It's 7 or 9, depending on how you count them.
Oh, with your novellas?
Yeah, because there are seven full length novels and 2 novellas. So this is actually number 9, but two of those are only half length books.
Okay.
But this one was a real struggle to write.
Do you ever think about giving up on a book that you've been writing, or is that just not something that you would want to do?
Oh yes, I have 2, 3, I think, that are lounging and languishing in the back of my inbox, back of my hard drive. 2 of which are 100,000 words.
Wow.
Never to be revisited?
One of them will be revisited one day.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is complete dross, unfortunately. And then there's the unpublishable first novel that everybody has, I think, as well. That's hiding there somewhere as well. So there's at least 3.
Mm-hmm.
When did you write your first unpublishable, in your terms, novel? Were you younger then? Like, was that like a sort of a younger thing that you did and then you revisited writing, or?
No, must have been around 2000 and must have been about 15 years ago. God, I've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, you have.
Oh, yeah. No, that's an unpublishable novel, because there are people who would have to die before that could be published.
I was going to ask, what makes the book unpublishable?
Yeah, exactly.
That particular one, the fear of landing in a court.
Right. Oh, I see. Okay. Very practical reason there. I was going to say, where do you get do you ever look for outsiders' perspective on, how your writing's going? Who do you turn to give advice and feedback? Obviously, there's a specific reason why this one's not seeing the light of day, but generally, who would you turn to help you see whether this is going to be a good book or not? It's not quite working.
Normally, I can tell if it's going to work, because if it's a real struggle to write, then those seem to be the ones that people like more.
Okay.
It's the ones that come fairly easily, that get the bad reviews, and the ones that I really struggle and fight with are the ones that people seem to prefer. But I have a couple of people that I can bounce ideas off. Not my wife, unfortunately. She doesn't want to see it until it's printed. Thanks.
Well, that might make for a happier, more tranquil home life. I find that really interesting to think that, why do you think that is? Is it because you've put more time into it? I mean, lots of people like crime because of the problem solving. So do you think there's something to do with that the ones you struggle with, you're really, working through the ideas in a more complex way? Or have you worked out why that seems to be the case?
I think it's just because there's more work goes into it that makes it a better book. And I tend to get, if it's one that's a struggle as well, then I tend to get challenged more by my editor and the copy editor to say, no, is this right? How shouldn't this be here? Why have you done that? Don't you think you ought to change, or that kind of stuff? And the challenges really make a difference as well. That's a very worthwhile part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. And so, how you've written a lot of your lead characters are female. So could you tell us a bit about why you chose to write that way, and like why you chose the characters as female?
Yeah. In the very first book was called Frozen Out, and that was the original story. And when I started writing it, I had to put my hands up and admit that I'd been watching a little bit too much Wallander. And the original lead character was Wallander, unconsciously.
Yeah.
And she was the sidekick. And after I'd put it aside for the original, probably about a third of the manuscript, I put it aside after a while and came back to it and looked at it again and realised that this bloke was just a pile of cliches all rolled into one. The grumpy middle-aged detective with a pizza fixation or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And there was this much more interesting character who was almost in the wings, in the shadow of him. Uh-huh. So she was promoted and he was got rid of. and that's how she came to be the lead character.
And did you find it quite easy writing from a woman's perspective, or was it quite challenging?
I didn't think about it. I just did it. I didn't find it particularly difficult. I mean, at that time, my daughters were living at home as well. So I was living in a very female-heavy household with these 3 women, and even the cat was female, who, all of them the kind of women who don't hesitate to tell you if you're doing something wrong.
My kind of woman.
Yes. Determined, organised, independent, strong-minded women. So I've been surrounded by them for a long time. So it was presumably I've absorbed that somehow, just absorbed it by osmosis. Mm-hmm. So I think the gender gap was no huge problem. Uh-huh. But I have tried writing from the point of view of somebody much younger.
Yeah.
And that was much more of an obstacle. Mm-hmm. I found the age gap much more of a barrier than the gender gap.
What do you think that was?
I don't know, I just found it very difficult to inhabit the head of somebody in their 20s. Mm-hmm. In fact, I had to give up on it. I couldn't do it. I had to leave that.
I feel like there's so many changes as well, isn't there? As like you get older, the world also changes. So you being when you were 20 is probably very different to what a 20-year-old is doing or thinking now. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the landscape or the atmosphere of living in Iceland has affected your writing?
The setting is vitally important. Mm-hmm. Because the setting becomes a whole extra character.
Yeah.
And it's something that I noticed that especially in the translation stuff I've done, this is something Icelandic authors don't do. They don't put any setting in there.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, because they're writing for their own audience.
Right.
Everybody knows what Asia looks like. You don't need to describe it. Everybody knows what the roads are like when they're knee-deep in snow. You don't need to describe that. So they don't.
Interesting, because you think about if that book's going to be sold globally, that would be maybe an addition. Would that not be a thing that maybe they think about adding in? I mean, I'm asking you, I know I'm not talking about your books, but from your opinion.
I think if they were writing specifically for an overseas audience, then they would do that, but they're not. They're the ones I've worked with in particular, they're writing very much with their own home readership in mind. Mm. But this is the stuff that editors tend to add in afterwards, into the translation afterwards. Say, oh, can you put in this, and can we put a bit of description there, and you have to explain this or that. Mm-hmm. It's not a translator's job to do this, so I tend not to do it.
Yeah.
So then
unless it's
you would get those notes and then you would add it in, or would the author add it in and then you would retranslate it? How does that work?
A bit of both. Sometimes I'll add it in and highlight it and then ask the author to okay it. Mm-hmm. And then invariably they do. Or sometimes the editor will ask them to put it in and they'll write it in English, and then the editor will polish it so that the grammar and the syntax fit the rest of the translation. Some editors do this and some don't.
Yeah.
Some prefer to have a very bare bones, faithful translation, and others are a little bit more flexible about what goes in. But you do need that little dollop of atmosphere, the stuff you need to explain for a foreign audience that Kaffivagnin is a cafe by the harbour in Reykjavik.
Yeah.
Which everybody in Iceland would know without having to be told. Mm. But we have to slip in a line or two or just a couple of words of explanation to make that plain.
And as you say, it adds so much to the tone and the atmosphere of the story, and becomes a character in its own right. And obviously through your translating and your many books, they're very successful as well. You've got a great sense of what makes a great crime book. So what can you distill that for us? Like, what is a great crime novel? What elements have to be there?
Ooh. difficult questions first.
Probably a murder.
There has to be a crime in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Preferably a murder. Not always a murder, but there has to be a crime in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be an interesting crime as well. My personal preferences are, I like twisty darkness.
Okay.
I like political machinations and backstabbing and blackmail and stuff like that.
Sounds wonderfully happy.
Yes,
Sounds very energetic.
Yes, a bit of blackmail and skullduggery, and I'm quite happy.
Mm-hmm.
What doesn't do it for me is the lone serial killer targeting young women, because that's been done so much.
Yeah.
And that doesn't float my boat particularly.
Yeah. So
But,
something with a bit more intrigue and complexity.
I like the intrigue. I like the complexity. That's what does it for me in particular.
Yeah.
But it has to follow that structure to an extent. The structure that every novel or film or whatnot follows more or less faithfully all the way through, and has done since the days of Greek theatre 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be some kind of resolution in there.
Yeah.
Although I do like loose ends as well.
Do you? It's quite a controversial thing to like. I think that's definitely almost like a hugely divisional thing, isn't it? A lot of people just like to tie it up. Some people don't seem to like it at all. It's really interesting.
No, I like loose ends. I like to think, well, what did happen there, and then it's up to you. What do you think? Yeah.
Would you find that also, is that like a positive even if it's a crime? So if it's a crime that's been committed, let's say, I don't know if this has ever happened in a book, but you don't know who the murderer is ever. So that's one of the loose ends that aren't tied up. Would that drive you a bit mad, or would you quite enjoy pondering on that afterwards?
Oh, I like pondering on that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't like I like some of it to be tied up, but not everything. I like to leave a few little quandaries there to ponder over.
I'm guessing. But where you've written so many books, do you ever worry that there's not going to be an idea around the corner, or do they just come to you?
All the time. All the time. I think, whoa, where did that come from? Right, what else? What can I do next?
Mm-hmm.
And something pops up, and it normally starts with the crime rather than anything else.
Okay.
So normally there's there's a crime somewhere that sets it off, or an incident of some kind. The last but one was when a guy I knew got made redundant, and I just imagined if it was somebody a little bit younger than him, and that was the trigger for it.
And in terms of keeping your series lead characters going, do you find that after, because we've been asking a few different authors, and it feels as if the character then just sort of takes on this whole life of its own, and it's very easy in some ways for you to make a plot decision of what the character would do, how they would react. Have you found that as well, that you've gotten to know your characters so well that you almost know how they're going to react to a certain conversation or situation?
Yeah, I think after a while you get to know your lead character well enough that you have a fairly good idea of what they would do in a particular situation. But this one's different actually, because it's one of the sidekicks who has a more prominent role. It's not so much the lead character in there. So it's
to throw the lead character over as you did before, or is this just a one-off for this book?
No, she's still in there, but she's watching her assistant bumbling along and making mistakes and trying to steer him in the right direction, and he's doing the grunt work. Okay. So there's a lot more from his point of view, and she's there more in the background, but still taking a part, and scratching her head, thinking, "Why on earth are you doing that? You shouldn't be doing." Okay, well, your job. But this one came about with don't quite know what triggered it really, but it's a man who disappears and fakes his own death.
Oh, I love that.
It's a guy who is faced with a set of circumstances where he has the opportunity to fake his own death, and it's a more or less on the spur of the moment decision, and he does it and disappears. And for 15 years he lives a lovely, comfortable life with a great job and a nice house in a foreign country in the sunshine and beautiful girlfriend. But after a few years, he starts to get restless, and he knows he shouldn't go home, but he does, because he has children and he wants to know what his children are up to.
Never look back.
You shouldn't look back, but he does.
Could you repeat the title of that one again for everybody?
This one's called Cold Malice, yeah, and this is the man who went home who shouldn't have. Because apparently there are only two kinds of crime novels. There's a man walks into a bar and a stranger rides into town. And this one is the stranger rides into town, but he's not a stranger.
Oh my goodness! That's next on my reading list. I'm assuming it's not got a happy ending.
Again?
I'm assuming it hasn't got a happy ending.
It depends on your point of view.
Mm-hmm.
It has a happy ending and it doesn't have a happy ending.
Amazing.
It depends who you are. Some people get a happy ending out of it, but not everybody does.
It feels, Quentin, like crime is really in your DNA, despite the fact that you've had this quite varied career, and you still do. If you could switch genres tomorrow, would there be any other genre you'd love to pick up, or is it really crime through and through?
I'd like to write historical stuff, possibly crime, but historical material. This is one of the reasons I'm not a very good journalist. Is because I always get tied up in the history of things and the background to why this is like that, and what they were doing 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and I forget to ask about what's happening now. So why is that important? Oh, but this in the 30s we were doing this. Okay, right, that's much more interesting. But I'd be very happy to potter around in stuff from 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. And in fact, one of the things that's waiting to be revisited is a story that happens about 100 years ago. But the problem there is that I really need to find the time to research.
Do you get a lot of time, I don't know, just to read? And if you do, is there a certain author that you are just always ready to reread, or an author that's totally changed, whose books have totally changed you or changed your perspective on anything?
I have to be quite careful with reading now because there's not nearly as much time as I would like. So I don't normally start a book unless I know it's going to be a good one. John le Carré always hits the spot, which is strange really, because his books are about old men sitting around drinking tea and talking.
Yeah.
But somehow they're unputdownable. And how he does it, I don't know, I wish I could do it. How can you make tea exciting? But he does. But he has that voice as well.
Yeah.
There's a certain voice in his stories that just reels you in. The one I'd like to see more of, and I've read all her books, and there aren't any more in English, is a French author called Dominique Manotti, and she's a professor of economic history at the Sorbonne. I think it's the Sorbonne, but at a university in Paris, and she's one of the 1968 on the barricades generation. And she writes these gritty, brutal, intelligent, smart crime stories, and I think there's only 4 in English. And they're brilliant. They are absolutely brilliant. I'm almost ready to study enough French to read them myself, because I know there are more.
Yeah. That's quite an accolade.
Yeah, but her books are brilliant, and they should be so much better known, and they're not. Lorraine Connection is the one to start with, and it won an international dagger.
Oh wow!
Yeah, but nobody seems to have heard of it. Even the ones written in the 90s address issues that have appeared since. I mean, she had a gay protagonist in one of the books, in several of the books, which back then was unheard of. And she's addressed terrorism and the Arab Spring before it even happened, and things like that. Very prescient lady. Do
you have any tips for anybody that wants to get into writing but is perhaps feeling blocked or not feeling like what they're doing is good enough? Like, what would you say to an aspiring writer today that would like to follow a similar track? Just keep going. Just get on with it. Don't wait for inspiration, because if you wait for inspiration, you'll wait a very long time. So just get on with it and push through it. And you have to push through the rubbish as well. You have to accept that a certain volume of what you write is going to be the dirt you have to dig through to get to the gold. You will feel frustrated and angry and fed up and all the rest of it, but just keep pushing through it and just keep writing, even if it's not very much. Even if it's only a few hundred words every now and again, or 300 words a day, half a page or a few paragraphs a day, but just to keep that continuity as well, because that also keeps things ticking over in your mind. Because if you do a little bit every day, then
you think about it every day as well, and that keeps the story alive in your mind as well, and then things will jump out at you, and your best ideas always come to you in the shower when you can't write them down.
Mine actually always do.
Always saying. Every day when she calls me with a good idea, she's like, I was just in the shower and I was thinking.
It's so weird. I feel like, because we've been reading The Artist's Way, and I don't know if you've heard of it, it's like a creative spiritual book by Julie Cameron. I think that's her name.
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah.
And in that, she says there's a certain paragraph that talks about personalities, and that if you do something repetitive and almost like mindless, something that you do often, and she's like, I mean, I know driving isn't necessarily mindless, but something that you're sort of on autopilot so you can drive, or like showering or getting dressed. She highlights that that's when a lot of people have their biggest ideas. And since reading that, I've just been amazed of how often it does happen in those moments. It's amazing.
She doesn't shower 10 hours a day though. That's what she's not doing.
When I was working on one of Ragnar's books, I can't remember which one it was. I think it was the second or the third one. There's a joke in there, and it's a joke you can't and jokes are a nightmare for a translator, because
they're so specific to humour in countries and cultures as well, aren't they?
Yeah, it's also a thing. If you get something like a play on words, you can't translate it. So you have this dilemma: do you translate it directly, and you're sort of faithful to what the author wrote, but it's not funny, so you're not being faithful, or you do replace it with something different that is funny, which is what the author wanted. And this particular one in one of Ragnar's books had been bugging me for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I kid you not, it came to me in the shower. Bing, right, that's what it is. Yes, got it, bing. And people, you really do rush out wrapped in a towel and scribble it down quickly.
I agree.
But that was the only joke in 5 books.
Really?
Yeah.
I suppose there's not much room for comedy and crime.
Not really, but yeah, Ragnar's books are quite serious.
Yeah.
So a joke was a little bit of a diversion for him.
So you wanted to get it right. You also mentioned earlier that you did a writing course, and I was just wondering whether you would recommend that to aspiring writers as well, in terms of just giving you confidence or overcoming specific challenges that you personally might find, whether it's plotting or characterization. Would you recommend it?
I think you have to make, it depends on the course.
Mm-hmm.
But this particular one I did, I really abused the lecturer and used him absolutely mercilessly as a copy editor. And I think you have to take these things a little bit by the scruff of the neck and make of it what you want.
Yeah.
Rather than just being force-fed stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, poor Sam. I really, really made him work hard for his fee.
I think that's a great tip as well, actually, because when you're on those courses, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how like rule following you are, but I feel like that's just a good thing for people to hear, that, you know, they can go back to the lecturer and they can sort of ask for the odd favour, because, you know, you are paying for that course, presumably. So there's
yeah.
So Quentin, where can people find you and more about your books?
You can find me on Amazon and Kobo and all good bookshops, which actually isn't very many. So I say good bookshops. I can be found in Oxfam shops as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's an Oxfam shop just along there, and there's one of mine on the shelf, which is interesting. On social media, I can be found on Facebook, and I can be found on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a website that has been sadly neglected for a long time, but is there anyway. And everything is under the Grauskeggur name, which is Graskegur, which means greybeard.
Ah,
nice and memorable. And we'll certainly link to all of that. When can we expect the next instalment of your series?
Paul Malice is published on the 11th of June.
Way!
It's an ebook on the 11th of June, and I think the audiobook and the paperback are out a week later.